common question I get, and I think a lot of folks are asking, is what causes homelessness? Is it mental health issues? Is it substance abuse? Is it poverty? And what I can say at a 30,000 foot perspective is it's really the cost of housing. And bad things happen to people all the time. People make mistakes and bad decisions all the time, but those don't always result in homelessness. So if you look at like a state level, for example, you can see that the rates of poverty in Mississippi, for example, are much higher than California, but the rates of homelessness are much higher in California. What's the difference? We don't have different numbers for, rates of mental illness or substance use. We do have different rates of poverty. And we also have very different costs of housing. And so what we see is that the higher a housing cost, the more likely it is that somebody's going to fall into homelessness if something happens. So that's really at a 30,000 foot perspective. I just think it's super important to also think about populations, right? So if we look at demographics of who becomes homeless, for example, in California, and we see this across the country, African Americans are much more likely to be overrepresented in who's homeless compared to who's, like, what proportion they are in the general population. And that's not because African Americans are making more bad decisions or having, more triggers necessarily. But what is happening is that those African Americans, as we know, if you look at anything having to do with inequality in our country, there are system level factors at play that are resulting in African Americans being having less access to wealth, less access to healthcare, having less access to good education. So all of those things can factor in to what happens to an individual, but also what happens to a population. And so there's another concept that I really appreciate called network impoverishment. And it's the idea that, so for example, when my son was very young, he got very, very, very ill. And my wife had to stop working. And we were suddenly lost like more than half our income. Our medical expenses went way up. We did not become homeless because our network, right, our families and our friends had enough resource in our circle to support us. So our parents had the money to help support us, help paying our rent, help paying our bills while we were in this really intense financial crunch. If you look at circles where maybe as a population, right, people have been systematically denied access to ownership of property, access to good schools, which then leads to better paying jobs, which then leads to having more wealth. All of those things, if you look at that, if somebody who was in a more impoverished network had the same thing happen that happened to me, which was totally just a fluke, they may be more likely to become homeless because they wouldn't have the same safety net that I did. And my safety net is informed by my race and my class of my ancestors. So all of those things are connected. But really it's at its most basic, it is in large part about the cost of housing. And if you step back even further from there, it's really related to policy. It's the policies that we set as a community, as a state, as a country, about where we're willing to put our resources, and are we willing to create policies that either lower the cost of housing or have enough programs in place so that if housing is expensive, there are programs that can help support people that actually can't afford them. That's my take in a nutshell.